My name's Gary Ford. I'm the policy advisor at PREPA. I thought it'd be of interest to our members to do a short webinar with two experts on avian influenza and vaccinating for avian influenza. There's a lot of discussion at the moment on why aren't we vaccinating for this dreadful disease. So we thought it'd be useful just to do a short webinar on the subject. I'm really pleased to say I'm joined today by Dave Hodson from Rosehill Poultry. Dave is hugely experienced in vaccination training and delivery of vaccines, and I'm sure many of you will have come across him. And I'm also delighted to say we're joined by Ian Lowry, who's a specialist poultry vet from Crowshall over in Norfolk. The aim is to raise awareness of why we're not vaccinating for AI at this moment in time, and to also talk about why we're not vaccinating for avian influenza. You may be aware that there is an AI vaccination task force been established. It's a cross-industry government group looking at the challenges around vaccination. That task force recently published a statement, and they're currently now working on a fuller report, which is expected in the summer, probably July. Both Ian and I are on that task force. The purpose of the webinar today is not to reach any conclusion or second guess what that report might say. This is purely an opportunity to hear from two experts in their field around AI vaccination and why why it's currently not available. So without any further ado, Dave, can you talk more generally about the benefits of vaccinating in the poultry sector and why we do it? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gary. The mechanism with poultry is when a new disease comes into a country and it has a significant effect on that country's population of, be they laying hens, broiler birds, breeders, is to establish whether it can be eliminated by culling. And if culling is not effective and it becomes endemic, then we will either develop a vaccine, seek out a vaccine, and then we'll incorporate its use. So that then triggers the use of it in a trial, but then it becomes standard. And if you take a UK pullet rearing standard vaccination programme, if you went back to the 70s or 80s, there might be 4 vaccines on it. Now they can have 16 to 20 individual vaccinations. We're vaccinating for 9 different diseases. What's unique about avian influenza that we don't really encounter with other diseases is we can use a lot of live vaccines for the bulk of the issues we face in the UK. So a live vaccine will induce protection, and the nature of the diseases that we're vaccinating for, they don't recombinate and they're not as volatile as avian influenza. So they're quite safe to have a live, say, respiratory vaccine in the field. And we can bring in a different respiratory vaccine if we need to, say with infectious bronchitis, where they'll get lots of different strains. Avian influenza is a challenge, really, because of the nature of the disease, how to incorporate vaccination, and the fact that when you start vaccinating, you've accepted that you've lost control of that disease to a point, and it can't be eliminated with culling. And that's where we are. And we're at the point now where it's a question of whether avian influenza becomes an issue that we can no longer control and we need to begin vaccinating, which is what Ian's going to go into the more complicated aspects of now.
Thanks very much, Dave. So Ian, poultry farmers are very familiar with the concept of vaccination to protect the welfare of their laying hens. We've just heard from Ian as to why we do it. Over to you in terms of why aren't we doing it for avian influenza, please.
Thanks, Gary. And Dave's exactly right. You know, that step to say that we need to vaccinate is a mission, I guess, both both at a national level and an international level, that we've lost the ability to control the disease. So I think we can all agree that AI is a really devastating disease of poultry that occurs pretty much globally. And virtually all trading nations and virtually all nations in the world will adopt a policy whereby they will report cases of AI and then stamp them out, i.e. cull them to remove that incidence of disease. And in order for that to work effectively, it needs to be very obvious when a flock of chickens has become infected with avian influenza. And in an unvaccinated flock of birds, that is the case, because we know the disease is devastating and will cause huge levels of mortality and morbidity. The problem around vaccination is what that will do for the clinical symptoms that those birds have developed. And to really delve into this, we need to get our heads around a slightly complicated concept, which is the type of immunity that these vaccines are inferring. So in an ideal world, a vaccine offers what we call sterile immunity. So we vaccinate the bird, and that bird can never become infected with that disease. Vaccines which offer sterile immunity are few and far between, because the nature of vaccines and the way that the immune system reacts to those vaccines means that in general terms, the bird has to become exposed and infected to the disease process to mount an immune response. So in virtually all cases that we see, certainly within the poultry industry, but more globally within the medical industry, we depend on a thing called protective immunity. So we vaccinate the birds, and those birds then have an ability to mount an immune response to disease. They reduce the clinical signs of disease, the level of mortality goes down, the amount of excretion, so the risk that those birds pass the disease on to another flock goes down. But crucially, those birds are not 100% protected from infection. They have become infected, but the signs of that disease have reduced significantly. And what we need to understand then is if we have that situation where we have lots of flocks vaccinated and they are not showing so severe signs of disease, we could have circulating disease which we don't know about because we aren't able to spot the disease as easily anymore, and then we are not able to stamp it out. So we become into this situation, as Dave quite rightly said, where the disease is circulating and we're managing it. But it's very important to understand that the vaccines that we would offer in this situation would not prevent infection per se, but just offer the birds more tools to deal with infection. And therefore, we would be saying that there is AI within the UK or within whichever nation decided to vaccinate, and that would have an impact on overall our internal economic production, because it would still have an impact even if it was reduced, but also in our ability to trade with other nations, because they wouldn't want to bring meat products or eggs in from a country that could have AI circulating and we just don't know about it.
Thank you, Ian. I think it's worth stating, of course, and perhaps I should have said this at the start, that legally we cannot vaccinate our commercial poultry for avian influenza. And this is the whole point of the task force, looking at the challenges and the obstacles to get to a point where vaccination can be recommended to ministers. And I think as well, you've touched upon, Ian, AI vaccination, unlike other poultry diseases, is not a silver bullet. One of the considerations is the cost benefit analysis, and a big part of the cost of vaccination is around this ongoing surveillance. And I don't know if you wanted to just bring that to life a bit more, because we don't do a great deal of surveillance for other diseases, probably with the exception of salmonella, but we certainly don't do any surveillance for perhaps IB or Gumboro. So if you could just bring the surveillance aspect to life, and also how do we ensure that in longer lived layers, how do we ensure we've got that efficacy of protection over the duration of lay? Because my understanding is at the moment, the only way we can vaccinate birds would be injectable. So that would be day old and at transfer. We haven't currently got an inlay, or we would need, or more to the point, we would need an inlay booster, but the prospect of upending poultry and injecting them at, say, I don't know, 50 weeks of age would be unpalatable. So we would need to develop a vaccine that could be delivered through the drinker lines. So I don't know if you just want to talk very briefly about some of those points in terms of the considerations that go into this, the challenges that the task force are currently facing into. Thank you.
Dave, did you want to talk quickly about the kind of the likely vaccine sort of program strategy, if you like, if in the event for long-lived birds, and how that might be affected by prevailing disease conditions, and then I'll talk a little bit about the surveillance.
Perfect. Yes. The unique challenge we have over here is, first of all, we're very good at keeping birds alive, so we can have very long-lived layers, as you both pointed out. Now, if you go to the east, where avian influenza vaccine is much more widespread, so China's, Indonesia, they will boost the birds in lay by picking them up and, say, injecting them. And they'll be shifting that vaccine they use constantly to what the surveillance is saying the challenges out there. So they're constantly keeping pace with it. So you could have a laying hen that has 3 injections in the laying house. That's never going to happen in the UK. The labour's far more expensive, the practicality won't work. So that reduces us to a position where you've got the in-hatchery and an injectable in rear. I'll probably be wrong, but I can't ever foresee a live vaccine being sprayed or given through the water just because of how volatile it is as a virus. So we need a vaccine we can give at the hatchery, ideally, and that persists throughout the laying period. But it all comes back to what Ian says. We're not stopping the disease, we're allowing the bird not to die from the disease. And potentially you could have a well-vaccinated flock, the surveillance picks it up, and you have to kill those birds anyway, even if they're vaccinated. So it doesn't make the problem go away.
I think that's right, Dave, and it's quite easy to fall into the mistake of thinking we've got a stable AI, because over the last 3 or 4 years, we've generally had the same H5N1 with the same clade. But if you look over a much longer time horizon, the type of AI that we've been dealing with changes every year. So if you were to make a decision about how chicks that were hatching today were going to be vaccinated, it would be unlikely that they would have had the right vaccine when they're 90 weeks old. And it is very unusual that the current situation has remained relatively static in terms of the AI virus that we're struggling with, but that's not going to stay the same forever. The live vaccination, the top-up vaccination in lay, for all the reasons Dave said, I totally agree. I can't imagine that that's going to be something that is going to be palatable for the public or for government. The unusual thing about the avian influenza virus is that it can recrudesce in mammals, and part of the reason we're so strict in controlling it is that there is a concern that this year's bird-based bird flu could become next year's human-based bird flu. And we know that similar kind of changes can occur in pigs, and certainly in recent times there's been detections in a fairly wide range of mammals. So to develop live vaccines that would be sprayed around and could potentially allow that intermingling in other mammalian species, there's going to be no appetite for that. So we are really looking at day-old vector vaccines in the hatchery, some RNA vaccines that are being developed, and administration of old-fashioned, if you like, inactivated oil-based vaccines at 12 or 16 weeks of age. I think the other thing which is useful for producers to think about is actually what are they looking for from a vaccine or a vaccine policy. And this is something, and as Gary said, we're not second guessing the AI task force, but it's something that was very early in that discussion process, and the outcomes haven't really been drawn together. But are we talking about having the ability to emergency vaccinate in the face of a particularly high incidence of disease in a certain area, or are we looking for routine vaccination to offer protection, blanket protection, all year round, all season round? And in either case, the first question I think is, well, who's going to vaccinate? Because it seems unlikely to me that broilers would be vaccinated. We've seen very few cases in broilers. They're very short-lived, and they're unlikely to pick up flu within their lifespan. So then the question kind of circles back round to the free-range layers or the long-lived layers. And if we're looking at long-lived layers, how do we predict which vaccine to use because of the timescales involved in their lifespan? And if we're talking about emergency vaccination and, say, seasonal turkeys, how do we mesh that in? How do we know it's going to be a bad season in August and September when those turkeys are hatching, when the first cases of disease generally only appear in October or November? So there's lots of practical issues there that there aren't any easy answers for, and that's not the fault of government or policy or of the vaccine manufacturers. They are simply practical elements of how this disease manifests and how we can practically protect our birds against it.
Thank you, Ian. An awful lot to unpick there, and it is a fairly fast-moving situation. As I say, the AI Vaccination Task Force are actively working on a report now with a view to publishing it in the summer. So I wonder, we may, if you're both available, we might just run another podcast in a month or two's time when some of the where we can just go into a bit more detail on some of the issues. Just to conclude this podcast, could I ask you both for a prediction? And I know it's crystal ball gazing, but I would like to get your sort of sense on when a commercially available AI vaccine might be available in the UK. So Dave, first, if you were looking at your crystal ball, when do you think those challenges that we've all discussed over the last quarter of an hour or so, when do you think they may be addressed to the point that such a vaccine would be available for commercial poultry?
That's the impossible to answer question. But if you look at other countries, what you do see is the minute this becomes a significant threat to human health, because it's a type A virus, so a lot of the serious pandemics that have existed in human history have come from type A influenzas. If that spreads to humans, it'll happen very quickly if it's seen that poultry pose a significant risk. I mean, how we live in the UK is very different to other countries. So the only thing that starts it instantly would be if we suddenly start getting mass transfers of avian influenza to humans, which seems very unlikely as it stands without a massive mutation. The next thing that could cause it is if our ability to produce food is compromised by very sizable losses of poultry, which hasn't happened. People's biosecurity has got a lot better. Things are getting better. We're working hard. Everyone's doing well together. We've got very good advice coming from Ian and the veterinarians in the UK industry. I'm going to be honest, I don't see it happening in the next 5 years. I don't see it unless things change.
Okay, thank you, Dave. Same question to you, Ian, please.
I totally agree with Dave. And we've touched on it, and there's perhaps something we could expand on if we talk again around that cost-benefit analysis. But the cost-benefit analysis changes radically if there becomes cases of human illness, and probably the cost-benefit analysis changes moderately if we see cases in other farmed livestock. And obviously recently we've had the case in sheep, and the US have many cases in cattle. So that would change things, and I think would speed things up. And to some extent, it makes a more plausible argument, because we've talked about how these vaccines could reduce excretion of disease. Well, we know in the UK that we haven't seen many cases that have passed flock to flock to flock. They're usually their own individual incursion. But infection of other livestock will be because the birds are excreting. So suddenly you shift the goalpost. That lack of absolute protection, which was a concern to us and prevented vaccination being an obvious solution, becomes less of a concern if we can stop birds excreting large amounts of virus and protect other livestock species. So that sort of thing will move the goalposts. It's hard to put a timescale on it. I wouldn't disagree with what Dave said. I guess I would, rather than answer your question, perhaps put like a wish list of what would be nice to see. So it would be nice that over the next 3 to 5 years we had an ability, if you like, to vaccinate certain sectors within the industry where we know the risk is particularly high, and that brings with it quite a lot of challenges around how we define those and what the surveillance would be on the back of that. But that would be, I guess, my wish list, is that we use the tools that are available to us, but in a really, really targeted way, and in a way that we can somehow, within a new legislative framework, permit vaccination of some sectors without other sectors being unfairly disadvantaged from a cost point of view.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ian. I think from a reference point of view, for our members that are watching and listening to this podcast over the coming weeks and months, the date of recording is the 28th of March 2025. Dave, Ian, thank you very much for your time. We will be revisiting this subject. There's a number of aspects that we can do, a little bit more of a deeper dive on, particularly as our knowledge progresses in this subject matter. So thank you both very much again, and thank you to everyone for listening.
Thanks, Gary.
Thanks, Gary.